إن الحمد لله نحمده ونستعينه ونستغفره ونعوذ بالله من شرور أنفسنا وسيئات أعمالنا من يهده الله فلا مضل له ومن يضلل فلا هادي له وأشهد أن لا إله إلا الله وحده لا شريك له وأشهد أن محمدا عبده ورسوله أما بعد. So carrying on then from where we left off last time, the author says, ويقال أيضا بنو عبيد القداح الذين ملكوا المغرب ومصر في زمن بني العباس كلهم يشهدون أن لا إله إلا الله وأن محمدا رسول الله ويدعون الإسلام ويصلون الجمعة والجماعة فلما أظهروا مخالفة الشريعة في أشياء دون ما نحن فيه أجمع العلماء على كفرهم وقتالهم وأن بلادهم بلاد حرب وغزاهم المسلمون حتى استنقذوا ما بأيديهم من بلدان المسلمين. Here he gives another example now. He says it can also be said that Banu Ubaid al-Qaddah, the ones who were in control of Morocco or the western areas and Egypt in the time of Bani al-Abbas, those people, Banu Ubaid al-Qaddah, they all used to testify to La ilaha illallah. They all used to testify to the Shahada and that Muhammad is the messenger of Allah, and they claimed Islam and they prayed Jum'ah and the congregational prayers. But when they made apparent opposition to the Sharia in other affairs, in other matters, then the scholars were agreed upon their disbelief and they were agreed upon fighting against them, and that their country, their land, was a land of war to fight against them. وَغَزَاهُمُ الْمُسْلِمُونَ, and so the Muslims, they went into battle against them. They sieged them until they retrieved what they had from the lands of the Muslims. This example now, it is a further example to highlight that a group of people may testify to La ilaha illallah. They may testify to Muhammadur Rasulullah. They may claim Islam. They may pray the Jum'ah prayers. They may establish the congregational prayers. But despite doing all of those things, they had opposition in some other affairs from the affairs of the Sharia, some other parts from the parts of the legislation. And so when they demonstrated their opposition to those parts, it was agreed upon by the scholars that they have committed kufr, even though the other parts, they were still testifying to them. They hadn't opposed and they weren't apparently opposing La ilaha illallah. They weren't apparently opposing Muhammadur Rasulullah. They weren't apparently opposing their claim to Islam. They weren't apparently opposing the Jumu'ah. They were establishing it. They weren't opposing the 5 prayers. They were establishing the congregations. They were establishing all of that. Yet because of their oppositions in some other areas and their rejection of some other areas of the Sharia, that was deemed sufficient by the scholars to declare them as disbelievers and to fight against them. In the explanation it mentions الَّذِينَ ادَّعُوا أَنَّهُمْ فَاطِمِيُّونَ وساعدهم على ذلك من ساعدهم وهم أدعياء ليسوا بفاطميين أبوهم وقصة تزوجه للمرأة وتاريخهم معروف الذين ملكوا المغرب ومصر في زمن بني العباس وطالت لهم يد أيضا على الحرمين وملوكهم يسمون الحاكميين الحاكم فلان والحاكم فلان. These individuals, they had authority, the Banu Ubayd al-Qaddah, they had authority for a long time in history. And they even had authority and control of the Haramain at one point. So these were individuals who had authority and rulership in history. And they were in charge or had some authority over the Haramain at some point also, for some lengthy period of time also, and their rulers were known as the Hakimiyin, the Hakim Fulan and the Hakim Fulan. This is a bit like the other areas in Egypt. The rulers are known as the Fara'ina, the Pharaohs, and in other areas the Caesars, in the other areas the Najashis. They are titles of the rulers of those areas. So here they were known by Al-Hakim, Al-Hakim such and such, and Al-Hakim such and such. And they were all testifying to the Shahadatain and to the prayer and to the Jum'ah. And they had even established law courts. ينصبون القضاة والمفتين. They had muftis and law courts. Meaning on the apparent, everything looked like they are upon Islam and practicing it and implementing it. Even law courts and muftis giving fatwas on Islam. It appeared like everything was in place with them. But there were certain parts of the legislation that they rejected or opposed. كاستحلال بعض المحرمات. For example, they declared certain things, the examples are not particularly mentioned, but they declared certain things that are haram Islamically as halal. They had declared and given their fatwas that certain things that are actually haram in Islam, they had said, no, that's halal. They had given the fatwa amongst themselves, it's halal, it's halal, it's halal, when actually those things were blatantly in the legislation, haram, haram, haram. So when they started declaring to be halal, that which in the Sharia was actually haram by the laws of Allah. For example, one example mentioned, they declared it permissible for a man to marry 2 wives. So far that's okay. But they declared it permissible for a man to marry 2 wives and for the 2 wives to be sisters, which we know Islamically is absolutely haram. And yet they declared that halal, for a man to marry 2 women and for those 2 women to be sisters. Blatant opposition to the legislation, blatant opposition to the Sharia and the law that Allah has legislated for us, upon the impermissibility of marrying two sisters simultaneously together. And so when they started giving these types of fatwas and declaring halal that which was clearly haram in the Sharia, then the scholars at that time were agreed upon their kufr, that they are upon disbelief, declaring blatant areas of the Sharia which are blatant that they are haram into halal. Allah has declared it haram, they are declaring it halal. Allah has declared it haram, they are declaring it halal. So the scholars were agreed upon their kufr for this. And لا جعلوا الشهادتين والصلاة والزكاة والجمعة والجماعة فرقا مؤثرا بل رأوه لاغيا. And the scholars of the time, the scholars of Ahlul Sunnah, did not take into consideration and believe that the fact that those people still testify to La ilaha illallah, and that they do the adhan and do the 5 congregational prayers and they establish the Jum'ah. The scholars of the time did not give weight to those affairs in this matter. Rather, they viewed those affairs as null and void. Laghiyan. They viewed those affairs as null and void. They were not matters that could be used to balance the affair, but we pray and we do the Jum'ah and we do the adhan and we testify La ilaha illallah. That could not be used as a make weight, as a balance to saying, therefore, because we believe in all of those, we should still be okay if we're declaring certain things Allah has made haram as halal. The scholar said no, absolutely not. These affairs are not a make weight for those affairs. If you commit the error to that level in these affairs, declaring halal what Allah has made haram, then the fact that you are testifying to La ilaha illallah and praying and the rest is null and void in the face of this. Meaning, back to what we mentioned before, a person could be testifying to multiple parts of the religion, but if they reject and go against one area, against the law of Allah, against the Sharia, they reject some part of the Quran or reject some part of the religion, then even if they accept other parts, those other parts are not a make weight. Those other parts are not a balance, but they believe in this, therefore that isn't a big deal. If they are rejecting the Sharia, declaring halal what Allah has made haram, then the scholars did not take into consideration these other affairs. They were considered null and void in the face of that. وَذَلِكَ أَنَّهُ وُجِدَ مُكَفِّرٌ فَلَمْ يَنْفَعْهُمْ مَا هُمْ فِيهِ. And that is because within them now was a mukaffir. And this is very important, that they had within them something, an affair that declared them to be upon kufr. So when they had an affair declaring them to be upon kufr, like the affair of rejecting the ayat and the rulings of the legislation of Allah, rejecting the law of Allah that this is haram and telling them it's halal, marry 2 sisters, blatantly rejecting the Sharia and the law of Allah, then that now is a mukaffir. That as an example, and the other things they were doing, because now they were rejecting the Quran, parts of the Quran, rejecting parts of the revelation in the Sunnah, which blatantly tell you it's haram. So that was now an action which created their kufr. And so if that's the case, those other affairs cannot save them in that matter. Just like we mentioned before, if a person prays 5 times a day, he gives the zakat every year, fasts Ramadan every year, goes and does hajj every year, but he rejects La ilaha illallah, then now he has a blatant mukaffir. Blatant that there is an affair declaring his kufr. That affair being that he rejects the Shahadatain, for example. So now these other affairs, the other 4 pillars of Islam, are null and void. You cannot say, but he still prays and he gives zakat and he does his fasting and he does his hajj. So he rejects the Shahada, but 4 and 1, maybe we can balance it. And maybe he can still be Muslim. It doesn't work like that. So now that there is a clear affair that is declaring his kufr, then the other affairs cannot be used as a make-weight. But it's important to remember on these points, this clear affair is not going to be something you suddenly judge by talking to somebody 2 minutes on the street and declaring them to be kuffar. Like we said before, the issue of takfir and declaring a particular and specific individual as kafir is another whole topic which follows and needs to be studied. Right now, these are the basic principles, but these principles and their in-depth and specific implementation upon individuals is not upon every person to go around making those rulings upon individuals. You're not going to go around saying this one is a kafir and that one is a kafir because he rejects this and he rejects that. There are multiple other affairs. We are at the beginning stages of talab al-ilm. You've done half of Kashf Shubuhaat, it doesn't qualify a person to go do takfir now. So then, the scholars at that time were agreed upon their disbelief. The scholars have mentioned, Shaykhul Islam Ibn Taymiyyah said that Banu Ubayd al-Qaddah, those people, their lineage actually came from the fire worshippers and the Jews. Banu Ubayd al-Qaddah, their lineage had actually come from the fire worshippers and the Jews. So the scholars were also agreed at their time that jihad was upon the believers against those people, against Banu Ubayd al-Qaddah. Jihad was valid against them, even though they were still saying, La ilaha illallah, Muhammadur Rasulullah, praying the Jum'ah, doing their 5 obligation prayers every day. Yet jihad was being declared against them because of the kufr in the other affairs. So the Muslims, they went out against them to retrieve the lands from them. فبذلك عرفت انكشاف هذه الشبهة وهو أن النطق بالشهادتين لا يكفي مع ما انضم إليه من فعل الطاعات إذا وجد أحد المكفرات. So the point that we are learning here is that this doubt of theirs, the original major doubt, which was that you can't use those evidences of the mushrikun from the time of the Prophet upon us, you cannot declare us as disbelievers and mushrikun because we testify to La ilaha illallah, we pray, we give zakat, we do hajj, we do all of these things, we establish Islam. So you cannot put these rulings of kufr onto them. That's what they were trying to claim. We establish Islam and all of these factors of Islam. So upon this one thing of going to the graves or calling upon the dead or this or that, you cannot declare these rulings upon us. We are not like the mushrikun of old. They never used to testify to La ilaha illallah or any part of Islam. So they are different to us. That was their doubt. But now we've clarified, to implement those rulings does not require that you have to reject everything. You reject certain aspects of the religion, you reject certain parts of the Quran and only accept other parts. That's a mukaffir. It is an affair sufficient to declare your disbelief. You accept certain parts of the Sharia, but you reject other parts of the Sharia, and you say, no, it's okay to marry 2 sisters. Then your rejection of these parts is sufficient. It does not require that you have to be like the mushrikun of old, and that you reject La ilaha illallah and you do all the rest and prostrate to idols. It is not a requirement. Your actions are actions of shirk. They are actions of rejection of the Sharia, rejection of the legislation of Allah. And so even if you testify to the other affairs, those specific actions of yours are sufficient for a ruling to be declared upon you. Then he says, وَيُقَالُ أَيْضًا إِذَا كَانَ الْأَوَّلُونَ لَمْ يَكْفُرُوا إلا لأنهم جمعوا بين الشرك وتكذيب الرسول والقرآن وإنكار البعث وغير ذلك، فما معنى الباب الذي ذكره العلماء في كل مذهب باب حكم المرتد وهو المسلم الذي يكفر بعد إسلامه؟ It is also said to this person, if the early ones, if they did not commit kufr except because they combined between shirk and belying the messenger and the Quran and rejecting the resurrection, and other than that, you are now saying to him, if you're trying to tell me that kufr can only be declared upon a person when he rejects everything, rejects the messenger, belies him, belies the Quran, rejects the resurrection and all of those affairs. If you're telling me that kufr can only be declared upon those types of people who reject everything, as he is trying to claim, then you tell him in that case, فَمَا مَعْنَى, what is the meaning therefore, الْبَابِ الَّذِي ذَكَرَهُ الْعُلَمَاء, the chapter that the scholars have mentioned in every madhab, which is the chapter Babu Hukm al-Murtad, the chapter regarding the rulings of the apostate. And the apostate is al-Muslimu alladhi yakfuru ba'da Islamihi, a Muslim who disbelieves after his Islam. فهذا المذكور في هذا الباب in the شرح إجماع منهم أنه يخرج من الملة ولو معه الشهادتان. In those chapters you find it in the books of the scholars when they talk about the rulings of the murtad, of the one who apostates, and that is a Muslim who then commits some mukaffir or falls into that and therefore is declared as a disbeliever, even if he is still saying La ilaha illallah. Those chapters about the apostates are not just the apostate who says I reject, or he says he rejects La ilaha illallah. It's not just that, that's obvious. That is obvious. A person who rejects La ilaha illallah, declares that he no longer accepts that, rejects that, that is clear and obvious upon his apostasy. But in these chapters there are further details and explanations given, and those further details and explanations in all of the madhahib, in their chapters about the apostates, talk about apostates who apostated due to other affairs, this part of the legislation, that part, because of this action or that action, and they may still have been saying La ilaha illallah. And we went through a blatant example earlier on, the people who were testifying to La ilaha illallah, and yet because of their belief that Ali radiyallahu anhu has some characteristics of Allah in him, they were clearly upon kufr, disbelievers, even though they were still saying La ilaha illallah. So the apostate can be someone who still testifies to La ilaha illallah, but because of his other affairs, because of some aqeedah that he falls into, some false aqeedah, maybe even a single statement. Perhaps it is a single statement, and that is a statement of kufr in regards to him. It could be, and that's why the scholars, they talk about kufr in speech. that a person may say something which are actually deemed as words of kufr, and he doesn't even realize it. There are chapters when the scholars talk about those things. A person may do things or say things that are actually from the boundaries of shirk, and he doesn't even realize. Many things from the minor shirk, many especially from the minor shirk. If you look at Kitab al-Tawheed and the chapters in Kitab al-Tawheed and the types of things which are mentioned in there, the statement of a person, if only I hadn't done this or that. Car crashed, if only I hadn't gone down that route. I was gonna go the other way, but I went that, if only I hadn't gone down that road. Impermissible. Impermissible to speak in this way. The wind, cursing the wind or cursing time. What a terrible day. A statement that a Muslim should not make. What a black day in history that was. These kinds of statements are not correct. They are from the folds of deficiency in your tawheed. And there are many things like that. They give the example of people on a ship, and the ship experiences difficulties on the ocean, but the sailor, the captain of the ship, very experienced, does his ship, he puts it into the right configuration, and the sails and everything, and the rudder and all the things, and he manages to make his way through the waves, even though it was very unlikely they could do it. But he was skilled captain, many years he managed to do it and configure the boat in the way that they managed to make it through the waves and survive. So the people, they say, was it not for the skill of the captain, we would have died yesterday. The ship would have gone down. Was it not for the skill of the captain, the ship would have gone down, we'd be gone now. Impermissible statement. And many people would not think about these things. These are normal statements people make, to the extent, and I always mention this example because it surprised me when I heard it, so you don't forget. When one of the mashayikh, he said, I don't like saying to people, when you ask somebody to do you a favor, can you remember to bring that saw or that tool or that screwdriver tomorrow, I need it, can you remember to bring it, I'm depending on you. I've got this job at home, I need to do this certain thing, remember to bring the screwdriver tomorrow, that particular one, you're the only one who's got it, remember to bring it, I'm depending on you. I'm depending on you. One of the mashayikh said, I hate to say this type of speech. I'm not depending on you. I'm depending upon Allah, not depending upon you. Even though we know that in this instance you do not, and most of the people would not mean a meaning in their intention that is wrong. It's a simple statement and a phrase that has become common upon the tongues of the people. I'm depending on you, remember such and such, I'm depending on you. But just because there can be a meaning from it that is from the meanings of shirk, one of the mashayikh said, I don't like to say those kinds of statements. And you could use the example when Abu Bakr as-Siddiq, or in some of the narrations it says it was Abu Bakr as-Siddiq, in other narrations it doesn't mention a name, radiyallahu anh, when they went to the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam because one of the munafiqun was oppressing them, not physically beating them up or anything, but he was doing harm to them, saying things about them, spreading things about them, doing things that was harming the Muslims a lot. So they went to the messenger, or they said to each other, let us go to the messenger and ask him to deal with this individual. So they went to the messenger saying to him that we have come to do istighatha with you. Istighatha, seeking aid and help and assistance from someone after some calamity or difficulty has occurred. Istighatha specifically, seeking aid and assistance to remove a difficulty that's already occurred. So they had this difficulty with this munafiq, and they went to the messenger saying, we're doing istighatha with you, linguistically and Islamically permissible. if that person has the qudrah, the istita'a, the ability to help you, then okay. And did the messenger have the ability to deal with that situation and to deal with that munafiq? Yeah. Absolutely. So, Islamically, that is permissible there. We've come to seek istighatha with you linguistically, Islamically, in that scenario, okay. But the messenger said to them regardless, إِنَّهُ لَا يُسْتَغَاثُ بِي إِنَّمَا يُسْتَغَاثُ بِاللَّهِ. That you do not seek istighatha with me, you seek it with Allah. Even though that situation and that scenario was a scenario of permissible speech and permissible request, but because of the greater affair of istighatha, seeking aid and assistance from calamities, which is from Allah, then the Prophet said to them, no. To close the door to something greater which would be a problem. So the point being as well here, that in these instances, they may proclaim certain things, they may proclaim certain parts of the religion, but their rejection of the other parts, their rejection of certain other sections, then that is sufficient to declare them to be upon kufr. And then he says, وَثُمَّ ذَكَرُوا أَنْوَاعًا كَثِيرًا كُلُّ نَوْعٍ مِنْهَا يُكَفِّرُ. That in those chapters of the apostate, they mention many different types of things that a person could do and end up in apostasy. They mention many different types of affairs, and every one of those affairs can be something that declares your kufr, your disbelief. وَيُحِلُّ دَمَ الرَّجُلِ وَمَالَهُ. And then it makes permissible the blood of the man and his wealth. حَتَّى إِنَّهُمْ ذَكَرُوا أَشْيَاءَ يَصِيرَةً عِنْدَ مَنْ فَعَلَهَا مِثْلَ كَلِمَةٍ يَقُولُهَا بِلِسَانِهِ دُونَ قَلْبِهِ. They even mentioned in those chapters simple things or very small things, minuscule things you would think, like a tiny statement that a person may make or a tiny action that a person may do, a statement that he may make and he doesn't intend it in his heart at all. Like a person may say, I'm depending on you. But obviously it doesn't mean he's not depending upon Allah and he's put his trust in Him. No, of course, a statement that the people make. He doesn't really intend much or anything with his heart. A statement, a phrase. But they mention some of these affairs. A person may make a statement. Even in his heart he doesn't intend that affair. أو كلمة يذكرها على وجه المزح واللعب. Or a statement that he mentions just jokingly. A statement that he makes just jokingly. حتى إن بعض أهل المذاهب يكفرون من صغر اسم المسجد أو المصحف. Some of them, they even used to declare kufr upon the one who declares or transforms the name of the masjid or the mushaf into the diminutive, into the small, to belittle. The one who belittles the mosque or belittles the mushaf. And again, in Kitab al-Tawheed, there are many examples of this type of thing. The famous narration about the ones who were laughing and jesting and joking. There are many examples. So the point there being, it is emphasizing everything we've said before. You tell him now, go to the chapters regarding the apostasy and see what you find there. All types of things are mentioned in there, different categories and different actions and statements that can be considered kufr from the person who does them or says them, even though he may still be proclaiming La ilaha illallah. So this all highlights that his understanding of the affairs is false. His understanding that shirk and all of these ayat and evidences about shirk, they are talking about the mushrikun who never even used to testify to La ilaha illallah. And they used to prostrate to idols and do these things. They are the mushrikun. All these evidences are about them. Not only them. a person may fall into affairs where these evidences become applicable to him. What time is the adhan? ويقال أيضا الذين قال الله فيهم, and you can also say to him that the ones whom Allah said about, يحلفون بالله ما قالوا ولقد قالوا كلمة الكفر وكفروا بعد إسلامهم. أما سمعت الله كفرهم بكلمة مع كونهم في زمن رسول الله صلى الله عليه وسلم ويجاهدون معه ويصلون معه ويزكون ويحجون ويوحدون. You can tell them also, those people whom the Quran said about them that they take an oath that they did not say it, but rather they said a word of kufr, and so they disbelieved after their Islam. He says, the author, do you not see here, do you not hear that Allah has declared them as disbelievers upon a statement that they made, despite the fact that they were at the time of the messenger with him, making jihad alongside him, praying with him, giving zakat, doing hajj, upon tawheed otherwise, but upon a statement that they made, they were declared as disbelievers, or kufr was mentioned upon them. وَكَذَلِكَ الَّذِينَ قَالَ اللَّهُ فِيهِمْ, and likewise the ones that Allah said about them, قُلْ أَبِاللَّهِ وَآيَاتِهِ وَرَسُولِهِ كُنْتُمْ تَسْتَهْزِئُونَ لَا تَعْتَذِرُوا قَدْ كَفَرْتُمْ بَعْدَ إِيمَانِكُمْ. Say, do you mock and jest with Allah and His ayat and His messenger? Do not make the excuse now, you have disbelieved after your iman. Those individuals, that's the story mentioned in Kitab al-Tawheed for those who have done it. Those individuals, it's mentioned how they started giving their excuses when they were speaking about the companions and saying the companions are gluttonous, they eat a lot, and the companions are cowards, and they were mentioning affairs. So then afterwards, when it became known, they said, no, it's just because the journey is long and we were killing time, just joking and jesting and just talking, killing time because of the length of the journey. And yet the ayah comes, do not make your excuse now. فهؤلاء الذين صرح الله أنهم كفروا بعد إيمانهم وهم مع رسول الله صلى الله عليه وسلم في غزوة تبوك قالوا كلمة ذكروا أنهم قالوها على وجه المزح. So those individuals in that story were going along with the messenger to the battle of Tabuk, and they said these words, and they said we were only joking and just messing around and just killing time, and yet that was not given to them as a reasoning or an excuse. كفروا بسبب كلمة واحدة وهم يعملون الأعمال شرعية ويعملون أعمال المسلمين فصاروا بها كفارا بعد إيمانهم لما صدر منهم شيء واحد صاروا كفارا مرتدين فبهذا تنكشف شبهة المشبه بهذه شبهة. So again, he's giving you this example to highlight that those people, because of that one action of theirs, those one few statements of theirs, which they said we were just joking and messing around and just killing time, we didn't mean it. Upon those statements that they made, the declaration of kufr was made upon them. The point of all of these examples is to emphasize that all of the evidences talking about shirk in the revelation, they are not just for the mushrikun in that time who were prostrating to idols and they did not believe in the La ilaha illallah and they didn't believe in the messenger and they didn't believe in the resurrection. They are mushrikun. But these evidences of the Quran and the Sunnah are not restricted to them only, and therefore the Muslims they can do as they wish. They can prostrate to the dead, and they can call upon the dead, and they can seek intercession with the dead, and say none of those evidences apply to Muslims. We say La ilaha illallah. That is a mistake. And it is a mistake many of the people make, even the so-called sheikhs out there on YouTube and here and there. Sheikh this and Mufti this and Allama this. In the West, people haven't studied anything, and they'll say to you, tawheed is a 5-minute thing. Tawheed is a 5-minute thing. Do you prostrate to idols? No. Khalas, you're okay. What are you worrying about? Do you prostrate to idols? No. Done. 5 minutes. What's all this kitab al-tawheed and Kashf ush-Shubuhaat and spending weeks and weeks? And this is how they bring it to the people, and they portray it to the people, some of the misguided ones, that tawheed is nothing. We need to talk about more important affairs. We need to talk about more important affairs. To talk about this country and that country and the politics. How are all of those affairs going to be resolved and fixed if the ummah cannot resolve and fix the affair of their aqeedah and the affair of tawheed? In those places, perhaps they are still wearing the amulets and going to the graves and seeking shafa'ah. All of those things occurring. The rectification in the ummah will occur through rectification of the aqeedah and tawheed. That's why, like we said, all of the verses or the chapters of the Quran that were revealed in Mecca focused on tawheed, tawheed, tawheed. Only afterwards the other revelations came about prayer and zakat and hajj and fasting and marriage and divorce and purification. Afterwards, initially the focus all upon that tawheed. فَتَأَمَّلْ هَذِهِ شُبْهَةً. He says, so focus on this doubt of theirs. وَهِيَ قَوْلُهُمْ. And it is their statement when they say, تُكَفِّرُونَ مِنَ الْمُسْلِمِينَ أُنَاسًا يَشْهَدُونَ أَنْ لَا إِلَهَ إِلَّا اللَّهِ وَيُصَلُّونَ وَيَصُومُونَ. Focus on this when they try to bring this to you and say, are you declaring people Muslims, people who testify to La ilaha illallah and they pray and they fast? You're declaring them as kuffar, that they are committing shirk. ثُمَّ تَأَمَّلْ جَوَابَهَا. But then focus on all of these answers. فَإِنَّهُ مِنْ أَنْفَعِ مَا فِي هَذِهِ الْأَوْرَاقِ. Because it is from the most beneficial of the affairs in these pages. That brings us to that section there. Any questions so far?